Good afternoon. I'm Maury Cohen, for those of you who do not know me. I am the director of the Graduate Environmental Policy Studies program at NJIT, and I've also recently taken over as the director of the undergraduate program in Science, Technology, and Society. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to today's Technology and Society Forum. Let me give my great thanks to Jay Caproff for all the work he does in pulling together these sessions, because without his Herculean commitment to this initiative, this slate of sessions that we hold each semester simply would not take place. So thank you, Jay. This afternoon's talk is about a quiet dimension of what we might think of as the contemporary crisis of unsustainability. This crisis has numerous dimensions. Most of us gathered here today are keenly aware of the profound challenges associated with global climate change. Biodiversity is being dangerously undermined by the destruction of habitat and other factors due to our resource-intensive lifestyles. We're overloading global nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. I could go on at considerable length, and those who have had me in class know that to be very much true. It's becoming increasingly clear that we need to start to draw some boundaries around the scope of human affairs to avoid a cascading series of deeply disturbing consequences in the not-so-distant future, and indeed some cases have already begun to manifest themselves. And of all these problems, as we know, will be compounded by the addition of 3 billion people to the planet's population over the next 4 decades. The dimension of our unsustainability that we are due to hear about today concerns growing global scarcity of water. Living as we do in a relatively humid and water-plentiful part of the world, we may be inclined to dismiss the severity of the larger scale situation, or perhaps deny it altogether. We have with us today Professor Upmanu Lall from the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering and Department of Civil Engineering and Engineering Mechanics at Columbia University. Dr. Lall also serves as the director of Columbia University's Water Center. He works at the intersection of hydroclimatology, climate science, and risk analysis. The challenges of global water security have become central to his research focus, and Dr. Lall has been working to develop technical and policy tools for the projection and management of the sustainability of the Earth system. Professor Lall will be speaking today on the topic of the worldwide water crisis, and we're delighted he's taken some time from his busy schedule to come and talk with us here today. So, Professor Lall, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to cross the river. I was mentioning that I've lived in New York for 12 years, and I had not been to the city of New York until Sunday, and here I am again. So this is sort of how life works, I guess. The topic today, I think, is quite germane for sustainability, and moreover, from a technology and society perspective, I can't think of a situation where technology is more needed to solve a societal problem, nor of a situation where societal action to stimulate that technology is more needed today, in a sense. So that's sort of the framing I have. Unfortunately, unlike the climate change story, where the canary in the mine is carbon dioxide, so we understand the story very well on either side of that, the water story is diverse. It's as rich as societies are on the planet, and the number of problems and the dimension of these problems is equally rich. So to do justice to that topic in an hour and cover all its dimensions is a bit of a challenge. So what we'll do is we'll do completely reductionistic activities that an engineer should be proud of, and we'll focus in on a few things and see how we can, instead of just alarming you, look at some directions towards solutions, both on the technology society side. So that's the plan. I threw these pictures together for fun. The biggest picture there is of irrigation, going on with fields, and it symbolizes the biggest use of water globally, okay, which is agriculture. So water and food security, the message is they go hand in hand. What that leads to is over here, the empty well, and that's the concern that comes in terms of water and food security. But if you look at things that are popular in the United States, for example, there's a lady called Maud Barlow who's become very popular, and this is a picture to basically establish her paradigm, which is her opposition to bottled water, okay? The total bottled water problem is really a problem of plastic and not really a water issue. Unfortunately, it gets much play. So this is all I'm ever going to say about it unless someone asks me a question. Then over there is a snapshot of the Everglades National Park in Florida, which shows you another dimension of this, which is as you engage in human activity to divert water for agriculture or food security, you essentially have a negative impact on ecological species. So this is something to keep in mind as an endpoint. The structure of this talk basically is that I'll try to lay out the paradigm that I think is important for understanding water, and that is that we see so many reports of water crises. The most common one is going to be from the United Nations. The Millennium Development Goal people come out and tell you that 2.8 billion people on the planet lack access to safe drinking water, sanitation, and health, and that's the fundamental problem. Yes, it is a big problem, and it's something that we need to address, but in the bigger picture, I think that can only be addressed if you address some other problems first. So starting out with those is scarcity, and this is locally, at least, insufficient supply relative to what you need, and the argument here is, think of it in the following way. Let's say that it rains for part of the year and it doesn't rain for the rest of the year. And you are living in the United States, in the northeastern part of the United States, and as Maury said, this is an area which has quite a bit of water, okay? Your population here, let's say, is modest, so the fact that rainfall fluctuates up and down is really not of great concern to you. You know, you have enough even in the lowest rainfall amount. But let's say now your needs grow, either population or you start growing food to send to Africa, because you may, right, out of a sense of responsibility. Now your consumption goes up, and every time there's a dip in supply, you have a problem. So that's, I think, a manifestation of scarcity, both in terms of the difference between the average supply and demand, and that induced by variability, which we would otherwise call droughts, okay? Most people who do scarcity metrics seem to concern themselves only with the average situation and not with the variability. And I thought I would make that point right off the bat. The second thing that comes up here that I've listed is depletion. And the depletion, the first example is perhaps the best one to think about. So you have water below the ground. The difference between water in rivers, which is something that we can get romantically attached to, versus water below the ground is that the speed at which water moves above ground can be measured in meters per second, okay? The speed with which water moves below ground can be measured in meters per year. So what's the significance of that? The water that you're extracting from below ground, depending on the depth that you go to, can be 10 years old or can be 10,000 years old, okay? If it is 10,000-year-old water and you start to extract that, in normal terms, this is called mining a resource. Once you start mining a resource, you have an end of the resource at the story. So from a sustainability perspective, that's an issue. And so scarcity, in a sense, breeds depletion. It also breeds degradation. And the best way to think about that is that if you come from virtually any society, one of the first things we did, and this is true in the United States until about 1974, was that we used rivers as a place where waste could be disposed of, because the amount of water in the river was relatively large compared to the waste that we were dropping in it. So the concentration of the waste was not harmful, okay? The load may have been high, but there was enough water there. So if you go through a cycle where you have started reducing the amount of water there, the concentrations now with the same loading go up. In fact, our loadings are going up too, because we have a higher population, hence higher per capita use, and hence more waste going in. So the degradation of these resources is then in that chain, and we end up there. The next consequence is you start losing species, and then there are people who are worried about the lack of access to safe drinking water and sanitation. So I think this being the focus of the Millennium Development Goals type of people is great, but it's merely a symptom of this whole story, and you actually have to work your way all the way up through the tree if you want to address this. And I like to make this point very strongly before student audiences, because many of you are perhaps involved in things like Engineers Without Borders. The typical paradigm is we'll go to Uganda, Ghana, whatever, and we are going to go install 8 latrines in each place, and we are going to come up with a rainwater harvesting system. That's wonderful. I'm glad that you're doing that, but unless you address the entire vertical, the next time you go back there, you may not find what you did, okay? So that's the point. The projections by the people who have been making these projections are that if you do business as usual on the water scenario, we are looking at a catastrophe with regard to water availability for the multiple uses that water goes for by 2025, 2050, depending on where you are in the world. And that 2050 horizon includes parts of the United States in a significant way. We hit, according to the UN, a population of 7 billion recently. The claim is that by 2050, there will be 7 billion people on the planet without access to safe drinking water. Who knows, these kind of things. But the key point here is business as usual. So we are used to analyses such as that now with climate change. Okay, there's lots of business as usual scenarios and what should be done to mitigate them. In this game, this scenario is not well populated. It's not well constrained. And that is true in part because of the local nature of the resource and the local nature of these crises, so other people are not terribly interested. And it's due in part to the fact that climate matters in this particular story. So if you can't predict climate with spatial specificity for a time period in the future, these scenarios are unconstrained. You don't really know what you're doing. So that's a bit of a problem. I've worked in water for a long time, but frankly, I've not been terribly interested in water. This is the other secret. Most people who work in fields such as hydrology today think that the exciting thing to do is science, which means that anything that used to be called engineering or actually dealing with societal issues is not sexy. It's something a consultant does. It's not what a hydrologist does or what a university professor does. So I've been victim of the same paradigm until I started waking up to the fact that, wait a minute, this is really the primary sustainability challenge that we face today. So that's my alarmist view. And I'm going to close with a non-alarmist view, and you'll see segments of that as I go through. Okay, so long time on that. So the type of stories on crises that you see are worldwide. I had another slide here with a map showing story from here, here, here. The map fills up, so let's not worry about that. This is from the UK, and these people claim this is the biggest risk. Goldman Sachs says it's a big risk, so it must be true, because they're going to figure out how to mine this financially and otherwise, right? In fact, they're setting up water funds, and they have strong interest in coming and talking about these things. Here's more stories from different places. Countries like India, overpumping of groundwater for agriculture is reaching crisis levels. The same can be said about the Midwestern United States. The same can be said about northern China. The same can be said about Saudi Arabia. So that's true across the world. This is US. We have more droughts. We believe climate change is causing them. And then these people throw in other environmental things. We also have increasing sprawl and population and general pestilence. So that's good, right? Here's people who say the US water supply is in jeopardy because there's a drought in Georgia. Yes, of course, right? I visited Georgia and North Carolina about the time this story came out, and people at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, were telling me that when they went to school there, they are professors now, when they went to school there in the 1950s and 1960s, there were 2 times when the water shortage because of a drought was severe enough that you were told that you were allowed to flush a toilet once per day in the dorms, okay? So this is not new. And the thing is that I indicated in the beginning that the dimensions of scarcity include drought. So yes, it includes this. But this is not the same as aridity, and one should draw a distinction between those things. Media love to blow these kind of things up, and media love to find scapegoats. So you have to watch out for that. And here they have various people who are perennially concerned about sustainability issues and environmental issues. So you get statements from them. The UN people are waking up to it. But you know what's interesting is that I was participating in when they were formulating the Millennium Development Goals. They said our goal is by 2012, we'll halve hunger on the planet. We'll halve the number of people who don't have access to safe drinking water, and it's important to put a date. What was interesting is that the people who were going to halve hunger had no discussion whatsoever about where's the water going to come from to grow the food. Okay, they were completely oblivious to that. So these things are quite disconnected when you go there. Stories in China, this is New York Times from some time back. Nature has done a whole series, a whole issue on there. But summarizing all that, basically these are the kind of things that people are talking about. Food, as I indicated, is a major issue. Sanitation and consumption, energy and development. If you read the media, the latest catchphrase is water, energy, and food, nexus. These three things go hand in hand, and if you try to solve a problem in one, you might screw yourself up on the other, so we have to figure out a solution jointly across all those. Navigation. This is an interesting one. How many of you realize that there were major floods on the Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi rivers this summer? Quite a few? Okay. So one of the consequences of that was that a major shipping company that operates out of Houston, Texas, is now out of business. They are out of business because they weren't able to operate on about 30 days during this summer with the channel closed, not because of a water shortage, but because of the floods. And the people in the upper Midwest who ship corn, et cetera, decided they'll go back to the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is what they used to use in the old days. So these are long-term contracts that are gone, end of that particular business. I'm not talking about floods today, but I'll give you two quick anecdotes on that. One is that there were floods in Thailand for the last 3 months, and there's been a fairly serious global repercussion on autos and electronics coming out of there. This is a nice little story. Judy Woodruff's PBS Evening News called me and they wanted to interview me, and my reaction was, sure, let me bone up on this a little bit and I'll be on your show this evening. So I dug into that story. At 3 o'clock, they did a pre-interview, and they said, well, so we want you to talk about the natural as well as the human factors. So I was prepared to talk about the role La Nina is playing in that particular story in terms of maintaining rainfall and the global supply chain impacts. And they said, no, that's not what we want you to talk about. We want you to talk about the fact that the government has mismanaged this story and they are releasing water from dams even as it is raining. And my reaction was, I'm sorry, that's not a bad story. These people hung on to filling water in the dams, and if it keeps raining for 3 months, the dams are not designed for this, and they are eventually going to have to release this or the dams will fail and you'll have a bigger problem. They said, oh no, if you're going to say that, we can't have you on the show. So they got a guy who's a crisis manager from the UN to do the show instead. But my point with that is that with many of these things, with the media, you really have to watch it today, because I think the story exists and they need the talking head to fill the story, and that leads to quite a bit of misinformation being produced over all this. So anyway, these are some of the stories, and one of the stories where there's a lot of misinformation is the glacier melt story associated with climate change. I won't talk much about that, but if you remind me at the end, we'll go to it. So summarizing what I've talked about so far, I think the core of the crisis is the crisis of scarcity. You have to address that first. If you address that, you're better placed to deal with pollution and degradation. I'm not saying by that don't enforce regulations on pollution. I'm saying you have to do this to provide the dilution capacity so you don't have to treat as much upfront. So it's an economic argument. And then the third crisis that you do this first, if you can assure that, this is a lot easier to do. So that's the idea. And the big drivers for these things are population, of course, climate, economy, land use. And if I put it that way, students, when I present this, the first thing is, do you want me to start killing people? Not really, but there are a bunch of people, Japanese and MIT people, who've been presenting papers on how they would like to shrink people. Okay, so there is that thought out there, and their idea is that if the Japanese one I particularly liked, this was at the International Sustainability Science Conference, as abstract readers, I was totally enthralled with the idea, not because I endorsed it, but I thought somebody like that should be out there. All the other people vetoed me, so it didn't work. But their idea was basically this. They wanted to tax people based on height. If you're below 5 feet 2, no tax. And after that, there's an escalating tax based on your height. Interestingly, the girth was not an issue. And they wanted to breed people selectively so that they would become smaller and smaller in the long run. So I thought that was a good idea, you know. Okay, so is water a global issue or a local issue? So today, the economic crisis is seen as a global issue, and we understand why. Climate is seen as a global issue, but water is not really seen as a global issue. So what are some arguments as to why we should look at it collectively, globally, rather than looking at it in my own backyard kind of situation? And the biggest argument is the one associated with agriculture. Globally, the average amount of water consumed by agriculture is about 70% of total water consumed. If you go to developing countries, it's about 90%, okay? The efficiency of water use in agriculture is only 5 to 15%. So what do we mean by efficiency of water use in agriculture? What that means is, let's say I take 100 units of water and I apply it to a field. What fraction of that water actually went through the plant, okay? So what did the rest do? It either went into the ground again or it evaporated off the soil, okay? So that's lost. So if I look at it that way and I say, let's take the 90 number to make life easier, and let's say that the efficiency there is 5, but let's make it 10%. So if the 90% of the water is going for a particular use, which is only 10% efficient, if I can make that 20% efficient, I've just generated as much water in that environment as all other uses currently use. Okay, this is stupid. How can I argue that there's a scarcity problem if the situation looks like that? Okay, so this is the beginning of optimism in the story. Okay, so the question is, how do you achieve that? And what I note here is that one of the factors is that we have tremendous subsidies associated with agriculture because we have absorbed the idea for a long time that we need to feed people. Okay, we are now starting to absorb the idea that we also have to water people. Okay, and maybe we have to water life itself. So that is something that has to be revisited. And one of the funnier stories that I ran into here was the case in Spain where groundwater levels have dropped tremendously. And I read a story saying this is due to climate change. And I was very curious, so I started calling colleagues I know in Spain, and I said, can you verify that you've had dramatically reduced precipitation, which then has led to drop in groundwater levels, either due to increasing use or due to reduced recharge? And they said, no, actually the reason the groundwater levels have dropped is because we have extensive cultivation of cotton, which is a large water user with low efficiency, and that is subsidized. And I asked them, why don't you get rid of the subsidies? You would solve this problem, it's easy. And their response was that, well, we are told that farmers in Texas get these subsidies, and we have to compete on the international market of cotton with these farmers, so we have to offer the same subsidies. It's stupidity multiplying itself in various places, okay? But that's the kind of argument that you get. How true that is universally, I don't know, but it is true that agricultural use is heavily subsidized across the world for water. The second argument is that we seem to, as humans, and here I'll approach religions and all faiths, everybody thinks that life has value and should be respected. So that's a global imperative. And if you, whether it is in the Amazon or in the Everglades or in the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta or in the Yangtze River, if there's species extinction, people start sending money to cute panda pictures, for example, right? So this is something we accept as global. The last point is that if you now start having significant problems in some places where they can't produce food, or they don't have water, or they have an excess of water, so they are flooding all the time, one of the issues that will show up is that there will be a strong pressure for migration, either across terrestrial boundaries or laterally. So that becomes a global issue. And overall, if the UN decides that they have a goal for reducing poverty, and most of the poverty in the world is associated with agriculture that is basically for the sustenance of the individual who's growing the food rather than even as a commercial product, then trying to do something about it becomes important. And we find that rainfall variability is a big issue in that and in crop growing. So essentially, the story that I pitched at you there is dominated by agriculture. And in a more recent version of that story, the energy story is kicking in because of biofuels primarily. But my belief is that biofuels are a passing phase, so we won't spend much time talking about that. This is a map that was generated by originally by the UN folks, and it's at a river basin scale, and it's their characterization of different metrics of scarcity. So they're giving physical water scarcity as the orange. Approaching physical water scarcity is the yellow. Economic water scarcity, which means that you don't have you have water, but you don't have the money to develop the infrastructure to extract the water, is red. And gray is little or no water scarcity, and then this particular color, which is there, is they haven't estimated it. All these kind of estimates are really very crude usually, and they average over big chunks of space, and they work over average annual numbers. So in terms of places where there's dramatic variability, like in the monsoonal belt, for example, in India, you have a monsoon season which lasts for 3 months. The other 9 months you don't get rain, and in those 3 months, you have 100 hours of rainfall. That's it for the whole year, okay? Whereas in New York, the probability of rainfall on any given day is roughly the same, irrespective of the calendar day of the year. So that's basically the key factor that is not captured by these kind of metrics, but is important. So at Columbia, we started working on this issue only about 5 years ago, seriously. Before that, we were making noise on all the different issues. And these 3 maps are water scarcity maps done by different organizations. And we selected the areas that are marked with circles to start working in to try to develop an understanding of what really are the dynamics that contribute to scarcity issues and what can be done to solve them. Not interested in beating the drum of scarcity. Okay, so I think this part I have talked about for the most part, so I'm just going to skip that and come to this picture. This is again from the UNEP folks, and what it tries to show you is how water use has changed over time. So those of you who've been exposed to the CO2 graph over the last century will look at this and say, aha, this looks very much similar. Of course, we have population times per capita use, both keep going up, so you get an exponential growth curve in all of these. So what you should pay attention to basically are the 2 colored bars. Ignore the thing they're calling waste for now. So this bar on the left is the amount of water diverted or extracted from a water body. The right graph is what is consumed. So consumed in the case of agriculture means evaporated or not available to the system. So if you look here from the size of the bars in terms of extracted, agriculture dominates domestic and industrial, okay? In terms of what is consumed, domestic is an insignificant portion, okay? Another way of thinking about it is the UN tells you that the minimum amount of water you need to do all your basic functions, domestic functions, not counting outdoor watering, is something like 40 liters per capita per day. In the New York area, we consume about 400, so whatever, okay? If you compare that to how much water a family would need on a per capita basis that you would need if you did your own farming and grew your own food, that would be something in the neighborhood of about 12,000 liters per day, okay? So that dwarfs that number, and that's why this is important. So that's the best way to keep track of that. Industrial use is relatively small according to the way these people have done it, but there's something goofy about this particular picture, and I have 2 choices, not to use it or to make my remark that they have sort of screwed up, because they haven't included water diversions for energy production in this properly, okay? And of course, none of these people consider water needs for ecology, so that's completely missing in the story. This is another graphic. This Professor Shi pointed me to this article, and this is from, I think, Fortune magazine. And what they have done is they want to communicate with people who are completely retarded, or slightly better than completely retarded. So they show you the total amount of water in the world in terms of drops, and they tell you this is the drop that's accessible as fresh water, These two drops are the drops that are associated with water in ice caps, and the rest of that is the ocean. Okay, I found this is an interesting way to present that story because you have to be better than retarded because you have to count all of these things. Okay, so are they, I wondered if their idea was that you would count this and multiply, or if you're completely retarded, you would sit there and count every single dot. Anyway, there's 100 of them, so that's 1% is what they're trying to flag for you, which actually is not accurate, but fine. So this is again where media is getting into the game. But here's the other graphic that's of interest here. They're showing you water footprint of different foods, and essentially the story here is, or water footprint of different foods down here and different countries down here. So this is how much an individual in the US uses in cubic meters per year. That's how much somebody in Thailand uses. These contrasts are small. Why these people didn't go all the way to Palestine, I don't know, or someplace in Africa. That number would be dramatically smaller. But the interesting thing that people like to point out is that, I can't even read this, so that's beef, and that's coffee. So 140 liters of water goes to make 1 cup of coffee is the argument, and 15,000 liters to make beef. It sort of makes sense. That cow grows for a number of years, you're feeding it, the mass of the cow is a lot bigger than you are, so it's eating a lot more than you are. So if you eventually eat it, you're eating a lot more resources than the cow itself, right? So that makes sense. So quick answer, how do you save water on the world? Give up beef, right? Give up any kind of meat, you're done. Anyway, that's sort of the kind of thing that comes up from this. Water for electricity, more counting games there, So, but basically the idea is that the diversions required to do this are fairly significant. And correspondingly, one of the largest energy users in an urban setting is water treatment, okay? Water and wastewater treatment, both in the treatment process and in moving water back and forth, okay? So since most of you, I presume, are engineering students or have some notion of that, suppose I wanted to address this, how would my water system in an urban environment change? What would be the one thing you would do which would be immediate? Thoughts? Okay, let me draw you a picture of the water cycle for an urban environment. Groundwater system or reservoir, I pump, which requires energy. I pump it such that I can meet fire requirements. For urban water system design, the pipes and the pumps have to be sized so that if a city block catches fire, you have enough pressure to douse that fire off. It's not for your domestic consumption, okay? In fact, you have pressure-reducing valves when the water pipe comes into your house so that you can drop the pressure down so that when you open your faucet, you're not blown away from there, okay? So it's sized for fire, so you have these big pumps and large pipes that you're pumping this through. So that's a big amount of energy, okay? Then the wastewater comes back from your houses and operational settings. It's collected in some place. It's pumped over, in many cases, to a wastewater treatment plant. It's treated, and from there, it's pumped over and discharged into a river. Sometimes the wastewater treatment plants are luckily located on a river, but not always, okay? So suppose you wanted to dramatically reduce energy consumption here. Given that picture, what would you want to do? Come on. You don't want me to grade you. Okay. Okay. Sure. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. Yep. Right. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Right, but just in the process, I'm looking for an energy solution. Yep. Okay, sure. You're trying to do recovery on the energy side, which is sexy nowadays because everybody wants energy solutions. People are not thinking about water solutions yet. Okay. Suppose you had a little device in your house that took the wastewater that you were generating and basically treated it back so that it was back at drinking water standards. Okay? Think about it this way. The water that was treated as wastewater, discharged into the river, was picked up at the next town and treated to make it into drinking water. Okay? So if you're going to do that and you're losing water and energy in the process, why not capture it at your house, treat it to drinking water standard, you avoid all the pumping energy costs right away. And the pumping energy costs are about 80% of the total energy costs associated with the process. So there are things to be done here which we haven't, which are easily doable, and we don't require replumbing the world, which is the argument given for other things. Okay, energy versus water. It's useful to look at it as a comparison. If I look at fossil energy versus, say, water as a comparison, there's some subtle differences. Go pick up any ONGC document or Oil Natural Gas Commission document or DOE document. What you will find is that they can give you precisely where they think the reserves of different types of fossil fuels are, what their calorific value is, what their sulfur content is, what's the cost of extraction, what's the cost of shipping, okay? So all that is known, and substitution by renewables is now heavily researched, and supply and demand curves are known. So you know the demand, people have established what people are willing to pay for the next increment of energy that they want to buy. Compare that with water. We may have average annual potential renewable source because that's rainfall, and people have been measuring rainfall. But even there, our data sets are pretty fragmented. Quantity and quality of river flows worldwide, not shared, okay? This is a matter of national security, so you aren't going to share that data with anybody else. Groundwater, the existence of groundwater is documented, but the reserves, nobody knows. Okay, there's not a single map you'll find worldwide that gives you that. Next, if you are located in a particular location, how do you substitute water that is there? There is no alternate available. You'd have to bring it from outside or reuse. So these come back to a point that if I want to make rational decisions about water versus energy, you can have a debate. It costs this is the source, this is the substitution aspect. With water, we are lost. So we have to address that informational gap before you can have a serious discussion about water. Green revolution, okay, so this is an interesting paradigm. I grew up in India, 1965 through 1967. There was a major famine. I remember every day, virtually, going to a government price-controlled store with my mother at 5 or 6 a.m., standing in line for the store to open, and then they would give you out wheat or rice or sugar at a controlled price. By 9 o'clock, it was gone, okay? So you kept repeating this exercise until your turn came and you came through it. The British Prime Minister at the time said, India is a basket case. The same kind of things they say about Africa. It's just not worth doing anything about it. Forget it. Then came the Green Revolution, and India is now self-sufficient in food and more, okay? So that story is parlayed, but there's an interesting subtext to that story which is not pointed out, and that subtext is the following. 7% of the agricultural area in India produces 70% of the food, okay? That's the part of the area where the Green Revolution actually took root, and they're listing all the things that are involved in the Green Revolution, okay? So what about the other 93% of that land area? The yields of food grains there are between 1 to 1.5 tons per hectare as compared to 5 tons in the area which produces, and as compared to 9 to 10 tons in the United States, okay? So that's not a good story. Now, it gets worse. One of the ingredients, one of the ingredients listed here is irrigation, which is application of water that is not rainfall. Turns out that in that 7% of the land area, this is heavily irrigated, which has led to a dramatic drop in groundwater tables. Mining of the resource, eventually extinction, okay? So it's a good news, bad news story. They solved the short-term problem. They missed solving the long-term problem. So what really was the solution that led to the short-term problem being solved in that 7% of the area? This is the list that everyone shows, and my answer is this list is not relevant because the piece that did it was that they established universities there that set up substantial extension programs that led farmers through the entire process, okay? In the other parts of the countries, either those universities were set up and were ineffective or they were never set up, okay? So being an academic it seems unreasonable for me to make that statement, but it's very clear in retrospect that this is what has happened there. So that is an important part of the story. So one of the questions that we've been dealing with is, how do you address this piece in the part of India where this kind of thing has happened? And so to get perspective on that, we look at a few slides and get some ideas. First, in terms of agricultural practices, when people apply irrigation, as part of the Green Revolution package, you also apply fertilizer, which then translates into nitrogen pollution becoming endemic in all the areas which have high application of fertilizer. So that's another part of the story. This is work by Charlie Vorosmarty, who's now at CUNY. And what he did some time back is that he looked at existing databases on climate and population and started looking at what is the nature of the water scarcity around the world. So the coding very simply is that if the average annual water need divided by the rainfall is greater than some percentage, 0.4 basically here, then he colors it red, otherwise it is blue. So it's a simple graphic of that sense. So this is what his picture is for the year 2000. Then he looks at what would happen if you have a climate change scenario superposed on this, what would happen if you have a population change scenario superposed on this, and what happens if you put both of those together. So the main point is just compare these two. You can see it's the change in population by 2025, that's the disaster, not the climate change story. Which is interesting because that makes you somewhat independent from the climate change story. But then you get graphics like this as people are starting to do more and more work with climate change. Here is a graphic which says that, I think this particular graphic applies to 2050, yeah. So here they are saying this is what the world situation would be, where the availability would decrease by 20, that color, or increase by 20, that color, around the world. This sort of a picture, I think, is very damaging because the predictive ability of the models that are producing these kind of pictures is basically zilch on the hydrological cycle. So you can say that there's a lot of uncertainty in this, and my concern is not with uncertainty, but systematic bias. Bias can't be corrected by taking more models and averaging them, and so on. So that's the issue. And why this is dangerous is the message that is sent to India and China is, hey, just hang in there, do whatever you want because you'll have 20% more water down the road, which is unlikely to be the case. Okay? Similarly, you're told here that you're going to have 20% less water, so maybe you should do something, and that is an asymmetric situation to this. I would love to see more conservation here, so I'm not objecting to it. Okay? So this is my media play on this kind of a story. Okay, so in my view, what is more important about climate? And that is due to this particular graphic that we did a few years back. And the graphic basically does this. It takes the GDP of all the countries in the world and compares that with mean annual rainfall of that country, with monthly rainfall variability of that country, and the colors here are across year variability of rainfall in the country. So basically, small droughts, big droughts, possibility of those countries. The size of the circle gives you the GDP of the country. So what you see here is remarkable that in this box lie almost all the countries with a high GDP in the world. Okay? Rainfall is relatively low to a medium level of rainfall. Very high rainfall doesn't work for you. But what is consistent in this is that your variability in rainfall across years and within year has to be small. If that's the case, you have high GDP. The exception, these guys here, are the oil countries. Okay. So that story works out pretty nicely. So from a climate point of view, the most important thing for water and poverty and agriculture is that you have to come out with ways to buffer variability in the resource that's available to you. So how do you do that? Okay. I mean, this is an illustration with respect to Zimbabwe and Ethiopia. It shows that their GDP fluctuates as the rainfall fluctuates. So that's the basic story there. So one of the ways you can buffer rainfall variability is by building dams. And there on top is the history of US building dams. So what you see is that Actually, it doesn't show that here, but the last major dam that was built in the United States was in the 1970s. We are not a dam building nation anymore. In fact, we are removing dams, is the way it's going. But that increases the variability that you're facing. And also look here at this graphic, which shows you what percentage of the average annual flow is stored in different regions. And what you see is that the drier the region is, you need to basically store more. Okay? But in many of these places where you have very high variability, your buffering capacity is actually quite limited. And some places like China, where Three Gorges was just built, the purpose for buffering it is very economic. The Chinese will tell you that Three Gorges was built with flood control as the primary goal, and then hydropower generation is a secondary goal, irrigation is a tertiary goal. In reality, most of the floods that happen on the Yangtze River occur because of rainfall that happens below the dam. Okay? So the real purpose was hydropower generation, and you can argue that one way or the other, but it's an economic purpose for which that was built. Okay, so this is one way of buffering it. The other way of buffering it is groundwater, but as I said earlier, groundwater is a slow process. You extract that, your buffering capacity is lost. So I'm going to move now to just one example instead of the world as a dig into water scarcity issues. And I'll take India for that. As I said, we've worked in other places, but this is a nice one. This is a paper that was published 2004 or 5, I think. And what these people argued that the government of India has an assessment of the total Indian renewable supply of water and the total water demand in the country. And based on that, they think that India might run out of water by the year 2050, but right now things are okay, all right? So these people published a paper where they said that actually in their estimate, the renewable supply is only that number compared to the number computed by the government, basically about 33% smaller. And their assertion was that the government had done a stupid job of using the rainfall plus the stream flow plus the groundwater as a renewable resource when everything actually that is renewable comes from rainfall. Now this kind of stupidity is happening in a country which has quite skilled people and has 130 years of rainfall data, which is about the best record in the world in that kind of a setting. So my point with this is that the informational gaps associated with water are significant, and these people are hung up on simply looking at this magic number, which is the aggregate number, which actually is a completely meaningless number, because as you look here, the variation in average annual rainfall across the country is dramatic. You go from about 100 millimeters of rainfall per year to about 4,000 millimeters of rainfall per year. Average all that out and you're okay. So if you could take this water and ship it there, life would be fine. And there are indeed proposals to do that, but that has significant environmental consequences and costs. So it's not clear that something like that is reasonable. If you look at the variability of rainfall, so this is standard deviation divided by the average, you can see that this is the region that has the highest variability. This is a desert. This thing is slightly better over here. So the 7% of land area in India that supplies most of the food grains is actually located right there. Okay, so that's not the optimal choice for doing something like this, but that's where this thing stuck. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And if you look at population density and groundwater usage, this map comes up. The interesting thing with this is that if this is the Ganges River basically going through and then into Bangladesh, the population density there, 50 kilometers on either side of the river, is about 1,500 people per square kilometer, which is the same as the New York City metropolitan area. And there are no high rises. These are rural people. Okay? So one paradigm we could have had is that you have people living in a concentrated setting, high population density. Then there's a low population density area that grows food for them and has abundant resources to bring to them. That's not true here. Okay? So that's a problem. Big variability in rainfall induced by El Nino. These are water deficits with the current cropping patterns in the country. If you only consider within-year variability on the left, and if you consider multiple-year droughts on the right, the main thing I'll say about this graphic is the red color means that the average annual water deficit is greater than the average annual rainfall. Okay? So those areas are the most agriculturally developed areas, and they're screwed. It's the simplest way of saying it. And they're screwed more when it's a drought, obviously. Okay. So if you look at this picture, this puts India in a global context. And this is the intensity of colors here tells you how much irrigation is being practiced in different parts of the world. And what you see is this is the highest intensity of irrigated agriculture in the world. The next is China, and then some in other places. Why is this being done? That graphic tells the story. The percentage of area that is irrigated in a district in India translates into income, straight up. Okay? This is the buffering value associated with it. So what has been happening here is that initially there were some canals and dams that were built. They fell in disuse. In fact, the percentage of water that is lost in canals in India, the government very proudly tells you is about 70%. It never reaches the fields. It's just lost on the way. So if people don't get that water, what do they resort to? They resort to groundwater because you can sink a well, and if you have electricity, you're in business. So India now, while it is not getting any gold medals in the Olympics, is the undisputed groundwater use champion in the world. Okay? And you see here, there's no change. In fact, there's a decline in surface water usage, a tremendous increase in this. Another way of seeing this is this picture. It shows you the density of wells in India. In 1960, the total number of wells in the country was 10,000. Now, it's approaching 1 billion. Okay? Pretty ridiculous. Okay. The net effect of this is, this area here is one of the areas we are working in. And 15 years ago, the depth to groundwater here was 25, 30 feet. Today, it's 400 feet. Okay. So that's pretty significant, right? These are all the blocks that the government reports where the average annual extraction of groundwater exceeds average annual recharge, all the red ones. So, and all this is agriculture, basically. Okay, so that's the story there. Now, if you look at productivity, the US delivers this many kilograms per hectare for each of these crops. These are the average numbers for India. So big gap, okay? So another way of saying this is that if I wanted to do corn in India and I could deliver US-style productivity, that's a factor of 4 gain, which means I need 1/4 as much land, 1/4 as much water. Okay? If I can play the game that way, this is a non-story. Okay? This is the manner in which irrigation is done, flood irrigation in India. Very wasteful. Okay? This is the way similar irrigation is done for the same crop in California. So basically the message is you have to increase agricultural water productivity. The question is how do you do it? And the government is basically not there in terms of coming up with these kind of stories. This is the same story basically. So what we started looking at, let's look here, is something like this. If we were to solve this, thinking at multiple levels, what are the kind of things you could do? One thing that came up was that would you grow the crops that are being grown in the places they are being grown, or would you shift them to some other place? For example, a place that gets 70 centimeters of rainfall, if it is growing rice and they're applying 1.8 meters of water for rice, that makes absolutely no sense. Should you go somewhere else? So that's one thing that we have looked at. The second is, in India, because it's a democracy, it works very well. If you want to be elected, you promise farmers that I'm going to give you free electricity, farmers vote for you, you are elected. So do you start trying to do something about that? Finally, can you do something with the farmers? Because what we found was the farmers are actually starting to see that they have real costs of free electricity going to them. The real costs come from the fact that they are deepening their wells by 5 to 10 meters every second or third year. Each time they deepen the well, they are unable to reuse the pipes that they put in before. They're starting with new pipes, new pumps, everything. So this is a serious cost. So they're looking for ways to do this. So they are interested. The last part is interesting also. It turns out that in India, 36% of food grains, okay, this is rice and wheat, that are in the public distribution system are lost to rats and to degradation before they are ever served, okay? For vegetables and fruits, the corresponding number is 50%, okay? So if you could cut that waste in half, all the water associated with that production is yours, okay? So these are the big ideas that we've been working on to try to do this. And this is, an illustration of where different things are grown today. And what we did was that we ran an optimization model whose goal was that at current prices, we would like to maximize net farm income in the country, defined as variable cost of growing each thing. There are differences in that. Not changing the crop area, not changing the irrigated area, and meeting the production needs of the population. So can you actually do this? And to be brave, we said we'll do this without any irrigation at all. Okay? Is it possible to do this on average? And the answer turned out to be yes. And in fact, you end up with 140% of the net total farm income as it is today with irrigation without doing irrigation, which is a remarkable story. So in terms of what is possible as a scenario, that's pretty grand. And it basically eliminates much of the water deficit associated with the problem by itself. Okay? So that's sort of the story there. Then digging in, we worked in two places. This is one of the places which most of the rice and wheat is being grown on and suffers from much of groundwater depletion. So we looked at the story, and the story basically is that the water use is 150% of total rainfall. So you have to solve that. This is due to the government electrical subsidy. They don't want to change the subsidy. So can you do something to change this particular story to a positive story? So what we've done there is, we said, suppose the politicians don't want to participate in this, can we work directly with the farmers and do something? And the strategies that we have done are these three: two ways of addressing rice water use, and one way of looking at changing the crops away from rice wheat to something which corporations might want to procure. Okay, for example, tomatoes, for example, high cash value products that don't use as much water. So we've run this as an experiment with 500 farmers last year and with about 6,000 farmers this year. And the main story that comes out is that a simple device which costs about $7 to make, that looks like this. This measures soil moisture and gives the farmer a binary signal. Once the water level in it drops to yellow, the farmer needs to water. If it's green, don't water. Okay? Just using this device, farmers were able to save about 35% of water in their rice application. Since rice is the major water user, this was a win. We didn't know if farmers would be interested in taking this up on their own. Yeah. And what basically transpired was that farmers, when they did the experiment, they did 1 acre with this practice, and in the rest of their land, they did whatever they wanted to. So the farmers who were in the program saw the benefits of this. No impact on yield, tremendous savings on water. They became salespersons. And so last year, it took us 6 weeks to recruit 500 farmers. This year, it was 10 days to recruit 5,500. So this is the kind of story that I think can be done. So that's the summary of that. In the other state, the politicians were more willing. So there we are doing an energy pricing reform experiment. And it's an odd way of doing marginal cost pricing. What we are doing is that the farmers pay a fixed cost for the use of electricity, but no marginal cost. So what they are told is that if you save relative to your last 3 years average worth of consumption, then we'll pay you for the savings at market rates. So this experiment has been going on now with about 1,200 farmers this year also. And the interesting thing here was that the value of the electricity exceeded the farmer's income, the electricity consumed by the farmer. So this is a fairly attractive proposition for the farmer. So what has transpired there is that in the first billing cycle of 2 months, 27% of the farmers showed electricity savings. Then they talked to the others, so then the second billing cycle, it's 90% of the farmers showing savings. So the maximum savings these guys can take it to is the fixed cost that they are being charged each year, because the government doesn't want to be in the business of writing checks to them. So what we are seeing is that the combination of these things, both of which are essentially behavioral rather than technology or policy measures, lead to dramatic changes in what can be achieved in this particular setting. And that's essentially the kind of summary that I'm coming up with. First, if you look at groundwater, historical use of groundwater was for drinking purposes and to buffer agricultural supply variations. I think that is where the paradigm needs to be. The second thing is that in the agricultural sector, it doesn't look really that hard to save water at very high scales. And it's really more an IT issue. IT is being taken very broadly here than anything else. So as I said, a large part of the water problem is behavioral practices coupled with appropriate technology. And appropriate technology, the remark I'll make here is that I've talked now to a lot of companies that manufacture soil moisture measurement devices. And I think they could have completely the wrong business model in their mind. They are going towards wireless sensors. They want sensors that are precise to the second decimal place. And what they need is something which is much cheaper that gives a binary signal that now it's trying to do something and the fuzziness is okay. And you can put it at many, many locations so that you have an appropriate signal. So that's something we are working on now. This comment I have here is everyone says that water is precious, but my point is it cannot be priceless. You have to have, even if it's a low price, if marginal cost pricing does send an appropriate signal to these people. And many people told us that you'll have to really educate farmers who are uneducated in what's the value that's being created for them as the pricing is disclosed to them. They were completely wrong. The farmers are really smart. They can figure out the value associated with each proposition instantaneously. Finally, this climate variability piece has to be addressed. So the fact that these people went to groundwater usage is not surprising. You have to come up with ways to buffer these for them. And the interesting thing is that if you take the place in Punjab where groundwater levels are dropping tremendously, there was a major dam that was built there in the 1960s. That dam, the canal system associated with that dam, it's estimated has 91% water loss before it gets to the farmers. You can't have that. The cost of fixing that through technology is less than the cost of 1 year worth of pumping. Okay, so completely foolish in a way. So that kind of thing can be addressed readily, and that would address that issue. Finally, the biggest water problem in the United States that remains unsolved is that of non-point source pollution. And my belief is that we've been approaching that all wrong. There have been lots of efforts to do so-called best management practices to restrict what comes off the farm, and these have not addressed the real problem. We have a potential win-win situation here where we can dramatically reduce the fertilizer application and contamination at the same time through appropriate sensing. And that's an opportunity that has to be created. And so, obviously, given those arguments, the glass is more than half full in this particular story. Okay. Thanks for putting up with my running over.